Welcome to the Student Ministry Matters podcast. We want to encourage, equip, and connect those with a passion to impact the next generation for Jesus Christ. Student ministry can be a lonely place. You might even feel like you're the only one in your church or community that cares about students. Well, know this, you're not alone. People all across the country are engaging Gen Z and care deeply about the spiritual direction of these young men and women. Whether you're full-time, part-time, bivocational, or volunteer, if you have a heart for students, this is the place for you.
Welcome to the podcast. My name is Dan Carson, and today we are talking student ministry again. First of all, I have Micah Powell.
Hey guys, what's up?
And Chris Vines.
Good to be here, Dan.
These guys are with me as usual, and I love our conversations as we work through some of the theoretical and some of the nuts and bolts of student ministry. Now, if you enjoyed today's podcast, let me encourage you to like, subscribe, and give us a rating and review. We're here for the paid and unpaid student ministry worker. We simply want to serve the full-time, part-time, bivocational, and volunteer student ministry workers that are out there. Now, I want to give a special shout out to our friends in California. If you have listened to a few episodes, you've learned that the three of us, we are currently based in Arkansas. And we just found out that our second highest group of downloads is actually from California. And we'd love to hear from you. If you are from outside of Arkansas, you can send us an email at info@studentministrymatters.com, or you can connect with us on Facebook or Instagram or through our website. We just love to hear from you so that we can connect. That's a part of who we are as an organization. Now, today we have a special treat for our listeners. Author, pastor, and CEO of Replicate Ministries, Chris Swain, is with us. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Hey, thanks, Dan. Excited to be here with you guys today.
Well, Chris is our featured speaker for the 2020 Student Ministry Workers Retreat coming up on September the 12th. Now, as you may or may not have heard, this year's event is going to be online only. COVID-19 has kicked us all in the face this summer, and it's still forcing us to gather in ways that we don't really want to embrace. However, there is a great side effect. The Student Ministry Matters is making this year's event free for attendees. Chris will be sharing 3 times throughout the day. We'll also have Zoom breakout groups that you can sign up for. And it's going to be a great day as we talk about discipleship. And so be sure to visit our website, studentministrymatters.com, and get registered today. We want to know that you're coming so we can plan, make sure we have enough groups and enough things set up so that we can just have a great day together. Now, Chris is the CEO of Replicate Ministries and serves at Long Hollow Baptist Church as the executive pastor of disciple making. After 4 years of service in the United States Marines, Chris served in full-time ministry for 2 decades in Arkansas, Florida, Texas, Georgia, and Tennessee, leading ministries ranging from students to collegiate to spiritual formation. Now, most recently, Chris served as the director of student ministry publishing at Lifeway Christian Resources, serving the church in its mission of making disciples. Chris's heart is to expand the gospel through disciple making in the local church. Chris is married and has 2 children. He's originally from Arkansas, and I believe that we even went to the same high school. Chris, I vaguely remember a conversation from Etch 2017. That's where we first met and talked. I learned that you graduated in 1991. Is that correct?
That is right. Yeah. Springdale High School, believe it or not, in Springdale, Arkansas. And 1991 is when that took place. And it seems like a long time ago now, but I can remember it like it was yesterday.
Go Bulldogs. That's all I have to say. As a 1990 graduate of Springdale High School, it was one of those cool God moments when I found out that that's where Chris was from. Now, I am excited to have you on our podcast today, and especially excited about what you're going to be sharing with our people in this year's Student Ministry Workers Retreat. I've been listening to the Replicate podcast since coming across it a couple of years ago, and believe that the approach that you and Dr. Robby Gallaty have refined is one of those that of extreme value to our churches and to our student ministries. And let me just ask quickly, should I call him Dr. Gallaty, Robby, or pastor?
Yeah, I would. I think he would be fine if you called him any of those except for Dr. Gallaty.
Okay.
He's not ashamed of his doctorate, but he's much more of a personable guy, likes to hang out. So Robby would probably be fine.
Well, what is great about podcasts is you guys have been speaking into my life for the last little bit, and I've had a chance to hear you. And in a lot of ways, I feel like I know you. I keep wanting to call him Dr. Gallaty, but we'll call him Pastor because that's what I've heard you call him.
That's the go-to for me. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, today I really wanted to give our listeners an opportunity to get a chance to get to know you a little bit and learn some of the broad strokes of your approach to discipleship. In addition, we want to hear about your new book with Pastor Gallaty. And so as we record this, we're looking ahead at a new school year across the country with so many uncertainties. At the beginning of lockdowns and of shelter-in-place orders, I saw your family on social media doing something that honestly looked like a lot of fun. We even talked about it, I think, a little bit on our podcast. With no March Madness to enjoy, you set up some brackets of your own. What did you do with that?
Yeah. Well, being in youth ministry obviously teaches you a lot. So I imagine everyone listening has learned so many things. But one of the things that it absolutely does is it teaches you to get better at games and competition, right? Every facet of ministry instructs you and informs you in some area of your life. So I felt like we needed a fun family competition that we could share with the world, something that might take the place of March Madness, knowing that we weren't going to get to watch any games. So we went head to head with Little Debbie snacking cakes, those delicious and really bad for you treats that just about everybody likes. And one of the things I've learned is everyone has their opinion as to what is the best, whether it is, going to be something chocolate, something that's not. I know for me, as we went through this challenge, each day we would eat two different choices, and then our family would vote. And as is probably the case in most families, one of our children was like always voting the opposite of what everyone else did. But that's why we had the majority rule in there. But yeah, it was an incredible challenge. It was fun. I probably gained more weight than I needed to, but we had a ton of people chime in and share their loving opinions with us that often differed from our own throughout the process. So it was great. Yeah, we had our Little Debbie snacking cake March Madness this year, and it may be something we bring in every year. If my weight holds out, we might be able to.
That's genius.
Well, I know Pastor Robby, he is a big guy, as in he just looks like a mountain of a man. And I know he must work out. And so did you pull him into that process any?
No, believe it or not, he has a even worse eating habit than me. So he's already, ice cream is his favorite food, and he loves Twinkies and cereal. So I'll let him, give a defense for that. But when you have armed and big kids, you're allowed to say that. Me, when you look at me, you just assume that I love cereal and Twinkies and Little Debbie's, right? So I think there's certainly a difference there.
Well, I've got these other two guys here, and I've got, for our listeners, Micah, Chris, what are your favorite Little Debbie snack cakes? What do you like?
Nutty bars.
Micah?
Every
Nutty
day
bars.
of the week. I could crunch those things up and put it in a thing of cereal and be happy.
How about you, Vines?
Dude, Swiss cake rolls. Those things are pretty good. Absolutely.
Well,
hey, and by the way, Chris, I'm just kind of scrolling. I'm Facebook stalking you right now. You've got a lot of sweet treats on your pictures on Facebook right now.
I do. Well, what I like to do is share with the world. Like, I blame my weight 100% on my wife. She is an amazing cook. So, I just have to point the finger at her. Honestly, if she didn't cook so good, I wouldn't look this big.
My favorite has always been the zebra cakes. So I got to ask, Chris, what was the big winner?
Well, the final, everyone mentioned one on here that was in the final three except you, Dan. Yours did not make it, unfortunately. And really because it had some great early challenges, not because we didn't love zebra cakes, because we absolutely do. But it came down to oatmeal cream pie and Nutty Buddies for us.
Yes.
And really, honestly, depending on the day, it could have been either one. It ended up being oatmeal cream pie for us. But man, if it had been the next day, we might have gone with the Nutty Buddy. So it really just depended upon the day. And that day, oatmeal cream pie took the win.
One of the fun things about, if there's a fun thing to take out of what we've all been experiencing over these last several months, has just been some family fun. And so I was glad to see that. It prompted me to mention it to some of the people in my life, and hoping they'd pick up something like that and do and just enjoy each other. There's so many bad things that have been happening, and moments that you get to spend with your family are just incredible. Well, appreciate you sharing that. I wanted to give our listeners, again, a chance to get to know you. And one of the best places to start is when we talk about your call to Christ, when Jesus saved you, and then your call to ministry. So would you share that with us?
Sure. Yeah, it was, believe it or not, I was 16, almost 17 years old, and I had only been to church a few times. My parents were, I would say, somewhat religious, but not in church and certainly not practicing their faith. And so I just kind of grew up, and I went with my grandmother from time to time or an aunt, but never really in any way that was impactful or meaningful. And when I was 16, I was invited to church in high school by a friend who was going to get baptized. And I thought, sure, I'll go watch you get baptized. So I went to church, and in going and connecting with that experience, it really exposed me to church in general and just a whole world that I had not experienced. Like I said, I didn't grow up in church. So walking in for the first time and seeing a group of students my age singing and playing games and hanging out, and someone teaching about the Bible, it was just new to me. And so it took me a few months, but in the course of those few months, I really did get to hear the gospel, get to be around believers. And one morning, sitting in my Sunday school class, my Sunday school teacher shared the gospel and then asked the question, if any of us needed to receive, accept and follow Jesus. And I raised my hand, and I remember kind of the look on his face was in horror because he didn't know what to do next. It was like we share the gospel a lot of times just expecting to kind of move on. And so I that day got on my knee, professed Christ, began to follow Jesus, got baptized that night. And a few months later, really it was about 9 months later, felt a specific call to ministry in that same church and began to work with students right away. So even as a senior in high school, I was a 8th grade Sunday school teacher. So at one point, my boss was actually one of the students from my Sunday school class, Ben Trueblood at Lifeway Christian Resources. He runs a student ministry up there. And so I worked for him for a while. So it's kind of incredible testimony there. But the big things that I remember about my testimony, just to encourage those leaders listening, is invitation is so big. You never know what God is going to do with an invitation. And at the same time, investing in those we invite is so crucial. We don't want to, turn our students into just mules to get people there. We don't want to see them as a ticket to a new face. At the same time, we want to encourage them to reach out and invite. But once we get those individuals that have been invited in our ministry, investing in them in such a way that they feel cared for and loved and obviously shared the gospel with. So it was an exciting time for me just because it was so new. And I remember my passion for the Lord then, and many times since, just, a return to that excitement and fervor for ministry, and God's blessed since then. Went in the Marines shortly after that, got out and began to step into serving with students, and really did student ministry on a volunteer level since 1991. And then in full-time ministry, from about 98 to about 2010, 2011. And so even when I went to Lifeway after that time frame, it was working with student ministry. And my belief is, if you're a student leader, you know this, if you can lead in student ministry, you can lead in any area of the church, because you're not just doing what a pastor might do. You're not just doing what some of the other ministries might do. You're doing it all. You're speaking and leading and planning and administrating and overseeing so much. So I've always felt like student ministry leaders are multifaceted leaders with tons of talent and the ability to do so much. And that's why I think you do see a lot of leaders in the church who began as student ministry leaders rise up because they have learned that there's so much more that they can do. And so it's exciting. That's kind of the testimony in a nutshell.
I had a recent conversation with our director of missions, and he said that so many church planters have their start in student ministry. And I thought, okay. But it makes sense, again, because as a student pastor, Chris Vines joked about it, of all the things that he did in the church right before we started recording, we've all been there. If you work with students and you're on staff, you're usually that second guy. So you are carrying, during COVID, in our smaller, more normative sized churches, we are the tech people. And so we're having to figure out everything. So,
well, and how many times have you heard someone trying to hire the role of the student pastor worship leader /
Yeah.
Like, hey, you can lead worship, you're a student pastor. And it's kind of funny because when you get together with other student pastors, a lot of times someone will pull out a guitar and you're like, oh, of course, you're a student pastor. Of course you know.
Yeah, I'm a lesser student pastor for that very reason.
I bet you're an incredible setup guy.
Well, I certainly can. I can convince other people to do things that I wouldn't do. Does that count?
Leadership 101. That's right.
Well, let's kind of move on. I want to know about. I know you've mentioned some of your time in student ministry. Can you share maybe a couple other lessons that you learned along the way?
Yeah, I mean, student ministry, again, I would say is foundational for me just because of the amount of time I spent in it. And most of the time I served in 4 different churches in student ministry, 4 very different contexts: Florida, Texas, Arkansas, in a couple of different contexts there. And so it's within those different moments of service to students, one of the things that I learned is oftentimes you're looked at as someone that is either a babysitter. And we all know that's not true, but we're looked at that way at some time. And then another thing that we're often looked at is the one who's kind of maybe most connected into growth for the church, because there are a lot, as you know, statistically, most believers come to Christ in that age frame of under 18. So through kids and student ministry specifically. And so oftentimes it's just a point of, hey, you're either a babysitter or you're the guy who's the most evangelistic on our staff because of those you minister to. And so the challenges I think that we face as student ministry leaders is to really look beyond those two things. I don't know of any student leader who would be satisfied saying, yeah, I'm a glorified babysitter. None of us want to wear that moniker. We want to invest in the lives of students. We want to invest in families. We want to see God do great things, or else we would go do something else and maybe be a babysitter, right? We would take another job somewhere if we didn't feel that God was really blessing and glorifying what he is doing through us as a student ministry leader. So one thing that I learned in my student ministry, and it took a while to get there, because I just was so new to the church in general, and I didn't grow up in church, so I didn't experience that side of it, is to invest in families and students. You know, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. It's one thing to get them there. It's another thing to truly invest in them. And I feel like ministry in 2020, especially in 2020, but for sure beyond 2020, has got to be focused on investing in the people we have. And by investment, I don't mean cranking out more programs. I don't mean implementing more studies and more and more and more. I mean building those relationships with parents and building those relationships with students. That investment is the most important thing you can do as a student pastor and a student leader. And I think those challenges that go with that investment are what you need to work on. That's what I need to work on as a leader, is how do I grow that area of ministry? Because we can all become better communicators. We can all become better teachers. We can hone our skills in figuring out how to do events and manage all of the programming for student ministry. But the thing that is, I think, most vital is that investment, because the honest truth is people will rarely remember what you say. They'll always remember how you made them feel. And it's not about us making them feel good. It's about us making sure they understand that we do care. And through the relationship vehicle, they're able to see who Jesus is. And so I think that's critical and very crucial. The second thing that I would kind of lean into today to just, as I reflected on my time in student ministry and the way I look at it now, is we've got to think long term. One of the biggest challenges in student ministry is seen as a stepping stone by everybody. You know, the pastor sees you thinking, okay, he'll do student ministry 2, 3, 4, maybe 10 years at most, and then he'll step into real ministry, quote unquote, right? we know that's not true, but that's the way it feels at times. And I would even say that parents, you're going to be a student minister for a while, and then you'll go be a real pastor, or whatever the thought might be. And I don't have a cynical view, by the way, of student ministry or of parents or of pastors. I just think that's a general mindset, is you'll be a student pastor for a while, and then you'll go plant a church, and then you'll become a worship pastor, and then you'll become a senior pastor, whatever. But the reality is, as student leaders, whether volunteer, whether called full-time in ministry, we have to think about the long-term impact of the ministry that we're doing, because the reality is you will not see maybe a lot of results immediately. But the satisfaction, I know you've experienced this, Dan, of looking at someone who you invested in 20 years ago, and maybe just even watching them from time to time on social media and how God's using them to make a huge impact. That's what we're after. That's what we want to see happen. And that is how we have to be, and that is why we have to be intentional now to see those long-term results. And so a big part of that mindset is, and it's tough, is to not see yourself, again, as what we mentioned before, as a babysitter or as a kind of a numbers generator. And the truth is, I think we become much, much happier and satisfied with our ministry when we do invest long-term. And we're thinking not about how long you may be at the church or how long your investment is going to be at the church, but what God is doing in your life, through your life, towards those families, towards those parents, and towards those students. That's that. I mean, I think that at its essence is what we're supposed to be doing as we equip our people to do the work of the ministry.
There is a great deal of relationship in what you shared, and that it's so key and so foundational. But also, it's relationships or what discipleship is all about. And that's what you're going to be sharing with us as we move towards that student ministry workers retreat, talking about discipleship and the student ministry. I know that pours out of a big place in your heart. Just recently, you and Pastor Robby released a new book together about the Replicate ministry. And so what are some of those big principles behind that approach to ministry, even about that book that you might share with us?
Yeah. So one of the things that we've done with Replicate is we have really kind of gone back, and Pastor Robby did this when he started the ministry. And obviously, as I came on and eventually became the CEO of the ministry, have fully invested myself in it. And really, it's stuff that you've probably done, and I have probably done in the past, but just not as intentionally. And it's really built around this concept of the discipleship pathway. And that's just kind of a bigger term set in place to describe the way Jesus did his ministry. And one of the things that I think is so interesting is Jesus gave us a template for how to do ministry, right? I mean, think of the things he taught us to do. He taught us how to pray. He taught us how to love people. He taught us how to walk with people. He taught us how to teach. I mean, there's so many things Jesus taught us, obviously. Why in the world have we missed, I believe we have we missed how to do ministry the way Jesus did ministry? And so what the discipleship pathway is, it just kind of looks at how Jesus did ministry. You know, he ministered in the crowds. He ministered to the congregation, the 120, towards the end of his ministry, we see the 72. He ministered to the 12, and then he ministered to that smaller group of Peter, James, and John, the 3. And so we look at these 4 different areas of ministry, and we can really easily, I should say, lay that on top of our student ministries and our church ministries to say, okay, well, we've got a congregation. That's nothing new. We probably have Sunday school or small groups in our church. That's that group of 12. And we do things where we're ministering to the crowds. We're being missional. We're going out. We're doing maybe large programs, or we're serving our community, or we're going overseas. We're getting into those 3 areas. And in some ways we're doing that well. Some ways we may need more help. But the one area that I really believe we've missed, and it's kind of the capstone of the Replicate ministry, it's the capstone at the center of our book, Replicate, is that discipleship group, that small group of 3 to 5, specifically set apart for 2 things that I don't think happens anywhere else in ministry, at least not very effectively. And that is accountability and multiplication. One of the struggles we see in ministry is we want our ministry to multiply. We want our small groups, our Sunday school classes to multiply, but yet we struggle with that. If you ask any group leader, whether it's a student leader or it's just, the church minister of education or whatever role, generally groups do not multiply nearly at the rate we wish they would. We teach them to birth a new group or launch a new group or plan a new group. We use all that language, but the reality is, our groups are not doing that. And I believe the reason is those types of groups were not intended to do that. They weren't intended to. And let me explain that. I do think you should see multiplication in groups, but you should see multiplication in groups that are intended for multiplication. Because if you think about what's happening in that group of 12 that Jesus was with, did that group multiply? Ask yourself that question. Did the 12 disciples multiply? Well, obviously, we think they did. And if you look at the scripture, they didn't immediately when Christ left, but they went out and they began to do ministry. And so there's some things that happened. But in that smaller group of 3 to 5, Peter, James, and John, that's where we feel like that what we would call a discipleship group and Replicate, we can see exponential multiplication and high accountability. When you're in your Sunday school class, when you're in your small group, you're probably not asking the deep, challenging questions to those in your group. And the reason being is you've got a lot of different people in there. Oftentimes you've got co-ed classes, so men and women, girls, students, you're going to have guys and girls in there. And the challenge with that is there are just some questions you probably shouldn't ask in those types of groups, right? But there are some things that you can walk through when it's 3 to 5. It's a specific period of time. It's high accountability, and it's focused on multiplying. And so I would just say, to summarize a really fairly large book, it's about 300 pages. It's pretty much a ministry strategy book for the individual to make disciples and for a minister to make disciples. And so that's kind of the basics of it. If you want to look at the strategy side of it, I would say kind of the big mission or vision of it is Jesus called us to make disciples. And we do so many other things with our ministries. And so we just really want to call leaders back to doing what Jesus commanded us to do in the Great Commission. And we are really passionate about that. When I talked about earlier, Dan, you mentioned this, the relationships and thinking long-term, that's all an outflow of discipleship and discipleship first. And so that's a big part of it. And then understanding evangelism through the lens of discipleship. We're highly evangelistic, and we believe you should be sharing the gospel. The problem is we don't have an area of accountability in our church most of the time where we hold people accountable to sharing the gospel. So we tell them to do it, right? We challenge our kids to do it in student ministry. We challenge our parents to do it. We challenge our congregations to do it. But there's no context really in which we hold them accountable to do it. So if you look at all of the successful evangelistic strategies of the past, evangelism explosion was around, Dan, when you and I were young in ministry. And you look at life as a strategy. 3 circles is kind of a more modern current strategy. All those are great strategies. Nothing's wrong with the strategy. But what worked for each of those is that they came back and were accountable to what they shared. And so that's why we would say, without this discipleship group mechanism, without the accountability you find in that type of group, you're not going to share the gospel as effectively, because no one's asking you, who are you praying for? How can we pray for you? Who have you shared with? How did that go? And so I would say that is a key part of how we're supposed to be both disciple makers as evangelists and as discipleship leaders.
As you think in terms of student ministry, how is this applied towards your church? I know that Long Hollow is, of course, a bigger church than perhaps the church I'm at. But is this mindset implemented in that case?
Yeah. So at Long Hollow, we have gone to extreme lengths to make the discipleship pathway visible and understood. And so we teach it, obviously, in our new members class. We have it visibly around the campus. When you walk into our student ministry facility and you go into our worship setting in there, it's got all 4 of these discipleship pathway elements visually displayed around the room. So it's built in, and our students see it, and we teach on it and we talk about it. Every time we talk through anything we do, your next step is a group. Your next step is a discipleship group. Your next step is to be doing missions. It's constantly thinking it, it's front of mind for us as leaders. And so we're plugging it in both visually around our campus, but then also strategically. So every time we do anything in ministry, we're asking ourselves this question, Dan: what is this an on-ramp to on the pathway? And if it's not an on-ramp to something on the pathway, then we're probably going to scrap it. And so, can we still do a lock-in? Heaven forbid, but let's say the answer is yes. Let's say there's a saint person out there who wants to do a lock-in, and I'm sure there is. Nothing against lock-ins for you guys if you love them, but I personally struggle as I get older, even more so, right? And but the question is, what is the end result of that lock-in? What is the on-ramp to ministry? Is it to say, man, we had 100 kids come to this lock-in? Is it to say, man, we had 5 people trust Christ at this lock-in? Yeah, those can be good metrics, especially salvation. Obviously, you want to lead people to Christ. But if that is the end result, then we missed it. We're looking at something that is a one-time event that we can kind of see go away, and it has no practical purpose for helping people move along the pathway. So what we would say is, hey, take that lock-in, and maybe there's an invitation for salvation there, but also how does it on-ramp them to plugging into life group, Sunday school, to launching a discipleship group, to being more missional? And where in the pathway can we put that event so it makes more sense to the holistic process of our ministry, and not so much as just another calendar event so parents think we're doing something, Not that anyone's ever put anything on the calendar with that in mind.
Chris Vines, you got something?
One, I just want to say I'm looking forward to reading the book Replicate. But Chris, I'm wondering, how would you differentiate this book from a previous book that Pastor Robby wrote called Growing Up?
Sure. Yeah, we actually wrote Replicate as a result of the usage of Growing Up. So one of the challenges with Growing Up is it focuses on kind of pastor's story, testimony, and it elaborates on the need to make disciples, but it doesn't necessarily give you that ministry focused strategy to do so. So I think anyone can pick up Growing Up and get a heart to make disciples, and even learn a few things about kind of how the discipleship group might come together. But I think what happens with Replicate is it goes so much further to map out the process beyond that individual group and beyond that one piece of the puzzle, to show how everything does fit together, to show how on-ramps can happen, to show how you personally, we have a big section that deals with you individually as a leader and your soul care, to show how this problem came about that we found ourselves in anyway. And then we literally go through the pathway, and there's 2 or 3 chapters on each section. One piece of it has 4 chapters, I think, even dedicated to it. And then we elaborate on how to gauge success. So not just saying, hey, let's put this into place, but how do we know we're winning with it? How do we know this is a success? How do we gauge success of spiritual growth? Because typically it's been attendance, salvation numbers, baptism numbers, we're succeeding. Well, you and I both know that while those are great things, and I don't want to diminish those in any way, that's not necessarily telling us that we're winning. That's giving us a number, and that can be good. But if you look at the statistics, specifically in the SBC in the last 20 years, we have gained 0 people. We baptized 7 million, and we've gained 0. So those statistics are hard to get around when it comes to our process and how we do ministry. Clearly, we have baptized and led people to Christ with the 7 million stat. But if the SBC has not grown at all, matter of fact, it's declined if you look at the numbers slightly over that time, something has got to change. And we would say that it's that investment, it's that discipleship group element that has got to be the piece.
Yeah, that's good. So just Growing Up seems to be the book with the philosophy behind the process, and then Replicate would be the field guide, so to speak.
Yes, I would say it's a much more practical, much more of a handbook. There's not a lot of fluff. I mean, there's not a lot of fluff in Growing Up either, but there is more of that, like you're saying, that philosophical approach, whereas Replicate is the nuts and bolts of how to get it done.
Yeah, no, that's cool, man.
Micah, do you have a question for Chris?
I'm made of questions, man. Chris, I got to meet you 3 years ago at the Discipleship Blueprint conference y'all put on, maybe 2017.
Okay.
And you were the MC. So you were the guy walking around with the microphone as people were drilling pastor with question after question. But man, we walked away with just incredible insights. And one of the questions I think that would be great for people that are listening, a good question for people, I think is this. I think say that a church is growing numerically, and they ask that question, do we really need discipleship? And say that they maybe are more in the mainstream of churches. I guess what's the real need of discipleship in a church that kind of feels like they've got discipleship figured out because people come to this production based church? What do you think? What would you say to something like that?
I think there's several historical examples of churches that have done exactly what you just mentioned, and I would say one that's probably more recent than others, or at least more recognizable, would be Willow Creek. And so that church had grown exponentially numerically over time. And for a period of time, it was kind of like the go-to, man, if you want to be a growing church, this is the one you need to check out. Now, obviously, this is all minus the recent revelations of the of the leadership and things like that. But not to go down that road, but just to say, hey, here's a church where it's growing by hundreds, it's growing by thousands, and people want to experience it. And then in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, they came out with a report to show that as things tailed off, they did not invest in a discipleship manner, and they paid the price for it in the way their congregation, the condition their congregation was in. Meaning, yes, they had gathered large crowds, but they did not disciple those crowds. And so one of the things that I will say is every major and blowing and going church where you go, man, this church just seems to be growing and it's incredible. There comes a tail end of that growth. And some churches you look at now, Dan and I can tell you of churches that, exploded, completely fell, top to bottom. And you probably have some examples too. Those who are listening, you can probably think of some churches, man, for a while, they were just exploding. I remember one of the churches I served at in Arkansas. I mean, for a time, it was like you couldn't hold back the growth. And then that growth stopped and then declined and then plateau. And plateau and decline is kind of the standard. And so I think the challenge is we can fool ourselves. And this goes back to the lesson I learned in student ministry I shared earlier. We can fool ourselves by filling a room really easily. I've heard someone say before, you can start a fight in a Walmart parking lot and draw a crowd, but that's not a ministry model I want to emulate, right? So I think that the difference is, and to answer that question, Micah, is what kind of eternal impact do you want to have? Do you want to have a bunch of people who said yes to Jesus, but kind of hung out at the kiddie pool until they died to go be with him? Or do you want to have disciples that you have equipped so that they can go out and make disciples elsewhere? And their spiritual growth is just as important as the numeric growth of the church. And so in saying all that, my goal is not to slam any type of church or any individual church, and not even Willow Creek. Just that's an example that they actually gave. They pinpointed the fact that in the study of their own ministry that they had failed in growing their people while simultaneously growing their numbers. So I would say the investment of discipleship in your people, that is that growth relationship that you're trying to see happen. That is truly us equipping the saints. I mean, think about it this way. If everyone showed up this Sunday, every single person on your membership roll, which I'm sure CIA can't even find half of those folks, but let's say they all showed up one Sunday to serve and said, we're ready to serve today. Well, in about 10 minutes, you'd have every position you need filled at the church. And then what do you do with the rest of them? So we can't think of service as how we accomplish our ministries at our church, right? What is our primary mission? It's to make disciples. Well, that's why the discipleship group model, in my mind, that Jesus gave to us is so critical, is because that is a ministry everyone can do at all times, and that is a ministry everyone should be doing. They don't necessarily even have to be trained to do it. Hey, read your Bible, walk through life with these 3 or 4 people, be intentional, be accountable, and multiply. I mean, I think there's the challenge with this is most people, Micah, see this as a program. Here's another new thing that's fresh out, that's exciting, that we haven't been doing. Let's try it for a while and see if it works. If that is your approach to discipleship groups, please don't try it. Please don't do it. It will not work. It will not work for you. You'll move through it just as quickly as you move through whatever the last, fresh new thing was that you did for a few years and quit. This has got to be something that is an investment of the leadership to believe that they can make a huge change in the lives of those they're leading by equipping them to be ministers of the gospel and to make disciples the way Jesus called them to make disciples. So that'd be my answer to that. Just a short answer to that one.
Well, I got 2 questions, but the next one, I've been definitely guilty of those numbers, really focusing on those numbers and really, I think young student pastors are maybe trained that way. I'm not sure, and not that we don't want to call out anybody, but there's a lot of students and student pastors that may listen to this, and what's some advice you would give them to protect them from some of those programmatic driven things, and what would you say specifically? What's some key things that you would just want to tell these students and these student workers what's something they can do to protect themselves from this manner of thing we're talking about?
I'd say, first of all, the numbers are not bad. And knowing the numbers and growing the numbers is not a bad thing. When it becomes bad is when that's all we do. When the focus of our ministry is to hit a certain number on a Sunday or a Wednesday. If that's and I know there's nobody out there who will admit to that. No one's going to say, raise their hand and say, oh, that's all I'm doing. But you and I both know, having served in ministry for more than a week, there are those weeks where you're like, man, this is we're struggling. There's a 3-week trend of being down 10%. We need to do something. How are we can turn this around? And churches where you have the weekly meeting and you're looking at the attendance and it's not tracking in the direction you want. I get all that. And my challenge to you there is, if you're serving at a church with that expectation and God has you there, then that's an expectation you need to step up and meet, because God's got you there working with the leadership over that church. And I believe he's a sovereign God who leads us to be at the place we're at if you've obeyed him and you're serving there. So you have to be obedient to that call. And if that means part of your challenge is growing those numbers, well, you got to do it. What I would argue, Micah, is that the true growth is going to be experienced through effective discipleship. In other words, if I train 5 or 6 other leaders to make disciples, and then they go out and multiply the next year, that natural numeric growth is going to happen. And for a while, you may find yourself between the two. Man, we've still got to be trying to figure out how to get numbers in the room here. But on the flip side, I'm building this engine that is eventually going to take control and blow up. Because as you look at the numbers in multiplication, and as you watch how multiplication happens, I think one of the things that we can all agree on is multiplication is always greater than addition. And so, whether I add 10 kids a week through whatever strategy, that's going to hold out for a while, but obviously that will top off at some point. But if I'm constantly training students to multiply themselves, eventually, and I think if you look at the numbers and do the math, within 6-7 years, you're reaching millions on the one hand, or tens of thousands on the one hand, whereas you've only reached a couple thousand on the other hand. And so, math is very difficult to argue with. Now, the challenge is the amount of time it can take to get there, obviously. And so it's the patience. So as a leader, you have to navigate those two things. You have to decide, I'm going to put in a system that is what Jesus has called us to do, because I know it's going to work and I know it's what he's emulated for us. But I still have to operate within the parameters of what my leader has called me to do, what my church expects. And so I think having an open, candid conversation with your leadership as to what you're attempting to do while navigating the two sides of that is crucial. And it's not easy. I mean, if I'm going to be honest with you, I'm not saying, hey, here's the easy new path to go down. I'm just saying it's, in my opinion, the biblical and right path to go down, right?
Yeah, man, that's awesome stuff. And my follow-up question, my last question that I had, really, just because discipleship is my favorite thing, man. Like, I like relationships, I like football, I like video games, but dude, brother, man, I love discipleship. It is my favorite thing. And so kind of a question within that, what is working for a disciple-making or disciple-minded church done for your personal walk with Christ?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've actually never had that question, so that's a first. I sit through a lot of Q&As, so man, I would say for me it's been exponential personal growth, and it's the same reason that discipleship groups are so effective. For the first time in a long time, I'm being held accountable to certain things. And as a believer, it's just taken for granted that Dan Carson reads his Bible on a consistent basis.
Yeah.
It's taken for granted that Dan Carson has a personal, flourishing relationship with Christ. Man, I hope that's the case. But if I'm honest with you, I'm not at Dan's house. And I'm not asking Dan every week what's going on in his life. And I'm not asking Dan to talk about how he lived out what he read. And so I would say on the microcosm level, that's how every discipleship group feels. But in answer to your question, that's what it's done for me personally as a leader. It's a refreshing ministry to be in when I know I'm walking the way God wants me to walk, and I've got guys around me who are emulating that and expecting that from me. And so it's just been a really cool experience to be in a ministry setting where there's mutual accountability and pursuit of Christ. I mean, I don't know any leader out there, anyone listening right now who doesn't want to be growing closer to Christ in an exponential way that eclipses that passion they first had when they stepped into ministry. And so I would argue that that's kind of how it's been for me in this last few years of working with Replicate.
Man, that's awesome. Thank you, man. Appreciate it.
For sure.
Chris, I have one other question that I'd really like for you to touch on before we wrap up today. Many of those of us that are listening we're out here. We're the second guy, or we're the third guy. We're, somewhere down the list. I remember being at one church, I was the gopher. That's what I felt like. My question for you is, say we become convicted and convinced that this is the right approach for our ministry while we're serving at whatever church we're at. How do we handle that? How do we navigate that, as we're not the lead pastor, but we feel like this is what God wants for our ministry there at that church?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dan. And I think that is where a lot of student ministry leaders find themselves on a lot of issues. Discipleship being one, but it might be, man, I really wish we could go. I don't know of a single student leader or really any second chair leader at a church who's not the main pastor who hasn't looked at another church longingly at some element of their ministry and thought, man, I wish we could do that here, or has prayed through or read a book and got excited and thought, hey, pastor, I want to go down this road. No, we're not going to go down that road. So it's a challenge. And I think there's a couple ways that I would answer that. One, I would always caution every leader, myself included, to be a David and not a Saul. No matter, and I'm not saying that to say that your leaders are a Saul, because I don't think they all are. But David never threw a spear back. He always pursued Christ, and he always stayed in what he knew was God's will, because the reality is God appointed Saul, right? Saul was God's leader. And so David treated Saul like God's leader, even as he was coming to kill David. So hopefully you're not going through that with your leader, right? But I would say, first of all, our heart has got to be the heart of David, where we are pursuing Christ, pursuing God, allowing God to work, trusting God, even when it is a challenging scenario where we potentially might look at our leader and think, man, I wish we could go a different direction. Well, here's the reality. God's put that leader in place. God is sovereign, and that leader's made the decision. So, obviously we can argue our points. We can prayerfully and humbly come with our opinion and strategy. But at the end of the day, we've got to honor what God's called us to do, or we've got to leave that church. I mean, those are the two options. So let's just say you're staying, which I hope you do, and toughen it out in a tough situation. And you want to go down the road of discipleship and discipleship groups, and your leader is not on board with that. My suggestion is this: you personally can start your discipleship group. That's not a job-oriented thing. Dan Carson can find your 4 or 5 guys and say, hey, for this next year, this next 9 months, we're going to walk together through, we're going to read these passages. We're going to meet. We're going to hold each other accountable. We're going to talk about what God's doing in our life. We're going to pray together, and then we're going to multiply at the end of that time. There's no, person in charge that can say, hey, you can't do that, right? That's your life personally as you pursue Christ as a believer. Forget ministry, just as a believer. So 1, you do it yourself. And then 2, what I like to say when it comes to this is the proof is in the end result, I should say, is in what you see happening. So I've seen churches where the staff wasn't on board and the staff didn't even know about it. And the lay people came asking for space because they were multiplying and their groups were growing. And the church staff were like, what's happening? What are you doing? And they actually said, let's go all in on this. This is amazing. I've seen churches where pastors have outright told their student guy or their next level guy, we're not going to do this at this church. That's not the kind of church we are. So I've seen those types of responses. None of those responses absolve us from the call that Christ has put on our lives to make disciples. So Dan and Micah and Chris and anyone listening out there, you are called to make disciples. And I recommend that you figure out how you're going to do that in your own context. Obviously, I suggest the model we present and replicate. So you do that. You find some other people who want to do that. And then I would argue that even if your pastor says, hey, you can't do this in a programmatic way in our ministry, I think you can have some of those conversations and say, well, let's say we don't do it, full on the way I want to be honorable to your leadership and follow up. But can I find some of our key leaders and have them do it? And maybe just show you, hey, in light of what we're doing, this is going to be a strategy that I think is going to be helpful. And then maybe you're working slower at it, but you're showing the result. Because here's the reality, Dan. At the end of the day, when a lay person walks into the pastor's office and sits down and says, man, I've been more challenged, I've grown more than I ever have in my faith, and I'm more excited about what God's going to do as he's been maturing me these last 2 or 3 months in this discipleship group I was in. about 3 or 4 of those conversations deep, your pastor begins to change his heart. That leader, whether it's the pastor, it could be minister of education, whatever, they begin to see the evidence of what's taking place. So I would say you can make disciples, period. Now, whether you do that in your church as a strategy of your church, you're submitting to the authority of your leadership. But even within that context, it may not be, hey, I'm going to fully implement this the way I want to. It may be, I'm going to slowly implement this and we're going to see what God does. And then you prayerfully see where God takes it.
Well, discipleship is pretty important. It's the main thing. Jesus made disciples. We need to be about what Jesus was about. Well, Chris Vines, do you have any other questions that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I've got one. And this is an easy one, Chris. I noticed, again, I told you, I Facebook stalked you like a good podcaster would, I guess. But I noticed in the background of one of your pictures, there was a disc golf catcher. So are you a disc golf fan?
I'm a big disc golf fan. As a matter of fact, I got to be a part of the notorious group that had a disc golf course put in at our church in Springdale. We just had a 9-basket course put in on our campus here at Long Hollow. I love it, man. I'm out as much as I can.
Awesome. Well, man, it's a recent hobby of mine. I'm about 4 months in, and we have some people who listen to this podcast who I know are awesome. Big disc golfers. And so, anyway, that was just an easy question to kind of finish our time. But anyway, I thought it was cool, man. So maybe we can catch up and play sometime.
For sure. At some point, we got to get out there and throw.
Come on up to Northwest Arkansas. We can go on that actual course that he's referring to. So
nice.
Thanks again for joining us today, Chris. If anyone wants to learn something more about you and about the ministry of Replicate, where should they start?
Yeah, you can just go to replicate.org, replicate.org. And that's got, if you want to get our reading plan, read about how the discipleship groups work. I like to tell people everything we teach, you don't have to buy anything ever. We've got the resources on the site. Obviously, if you want more information and you do want to purchase a book or whatever, you can get that information there as well. But replicate.org is kind of the hub that houses all the stuff that we do, whether it's resources, training, podcasts, books, and all that. You can find it located there.
And I would totally recommend their podcast. Pastor Robby and Chris spend a lot of time talking about some of these concepts and how they can be implemented in your church. And I'm very excited that Chris is going to be a part of our Student Ministry Workers Retreat. And so you'll be wanting to look for that. Thanks for joining us at Student Ministry Matters today. We would love to hear from you and find out that you're registered for the 2020 Student Ministry Workers Retreat. You can find out more information online at studentministrymatters.com. And so we just would encourage you to do that. And we want to say, have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the Student Ministry Matters podcast. Get connected at studentministrymatters.com or follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Student Ministry Matters. Until next time, keep up the great work with your students because the work matters.